Okay. So welcome everyone to this edition of the Quant Talks. We are it's a great pleasure to have Professor Vijay Raghavan Rajamani from TIFR here. And Vijay, as we all call him, is a leading researcher in India currently working on superconducting platform for quantum scalable quantum computation. A brief bio of Vijay. Vijay completed his bachelor's degree in physics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and then after a couple of years of pursuing a BA in natural sciences from the University of Cambridge, he moved to do a PhD at Yale University, where his thesis was on the Josephson bifurcation amplifier. It was one of the first theses that I read when I was starting out in this field. So I have fond memories of reading that thesis. And since then, Vijay moved to Irfan Siddiqui's group at Berkeley and did seminal work, starting with the first observation of quantum jumps in superconducting architecture, as well as the first demonstration of quantum feedback in a solid state quantum system. And since December 2012, he moved back to India and set up a quantum measurement and control laboratory at TIFR, where he has been leading the Indian effort in building a superconducting quantum processor. And today he'll be talking about a novel architecture that his group has developed for improving the scalability as well as the multi-connectivity of qubits. So let's hear from Vijay.
Thank you so much, Bala, for the kind introduction, and thanks to you and others for this invitation to the Quant Talk series. I have been seeing the list of speakers you have been able to get in this series, so it's exciting. In general, the environment on quantum computing in India is really thriving now, with lots of talks. In fact, too many talks to keep track of and attend, but I think that's a good thing. So happy to be here, and thank you for being accommodating to my request to push the talk. There was some last minute travel which had come up, because of which I couldn't be back in time. And thank you for all showing up at sort of a maybe post dinner or pre-dinner, depending on which part of the audience I'm addressing. I had a half dinner because it was too early for me to eat. So anyway, let's get started. As Bala said, I want to talk about this sort of latest results from our group, which also got recently published, on this ring resonator based coupler for really increasing the connectivity in a qubit network. And I will explain what I mean by connectivity in just a little bit. This work was primarily done by my senior PhD student Sumeru Hazra, who's now writing his thesis, with close support from Anirban Bhattacharjee, who's also going to be working on extensions of this idea, which I'll mention at the end of the talk. And of course, all the lab members contribute in almost all the projects. The picture you see is actually the device. It's made in a 3D circuit QED architecture with a machined microwave structure, but it's easily adaptable to a chip-based design. And in fact, we have started working on that as well. So let me move on, and let me just start by a very...
Vijay, sorry to just interrupt. So just some announcements that if anybody has a question, please use the raise hand button, and I will just call on you at an appropriate moment to ask the question. So absolutely. Please don't unmute yourself during the talk otherwise. Thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to ask questions during the talk if there is some clarification needed. I'll be happy to pause and take them. So a very quick introduction. I'm guessing most of you have heard superconducting qubit talks several times. And while there are many types of superconducting qubit designs, this particular design, which is just a simple Josephson junction shunted with a capacitor in this parallel LC circuit kind of configuration, is the most popular one, at least for building large scale processes in today's sort of scenario. And this is also the simplest in terms of understanding what the nature of the qubit is and how to think about the quantized levels. It's really just a nonlinear oscillator with the cosine potential sort of shown here on the right-hand side. The cosine potential comes from the nonlinearity, which is of the same form as that of a pendulum. So a pendulum is actually a nonlinear oscillator. When you use arbitrary displacement, only for small angles can it be considered as a harmonic oscillator. And the restoring force in a pendulum is proportional to the sine of the displacement. And you have a similar term in a Josephson junction, where the current is proportional to the sine of the phase difference across the Josephson junction. So that's what gives rise to the nonlinearity. And instead of having a parabolic harmonic potential with equally spaced levels, you have a cosine nonlinear potential, and the levels get successively closer because it's a softening potential. The sine has a negative term. The first nonlinear term has a negative sign. And the essential point here is that the transition frequency between the ground and the first excited state is now sufficiently different from the first and the second excited states. As you can see, there can be many levels depending on how you choose the parameters. And that allows you to isolate the two lowest levels to make a quantum two-level system, which is a qubit. The higher levels are always present, and depending on what you're doing, the exact quantum operation you're doing, they can either be a benign spectator or they could actually even participate in both positive and negative ways, where you can actually exploit the presence of the higher levels to do some important quantum operation. But they are present, they have some renormalization effects on the overall parameters of this quantum two-level system. Here's a picture of a device made in our lab, and this kind of a qubit is also called the transmon qubit. And this is the 3D circuit QED version, which basically means that these qubits are placed inside a machined cavity, which is sort of macroscopic in size. But even this qubit is nearly a millimeter in size, and you can almost see it with your naked eye. The big squares here form the capacitance, and the loop here in the middle is the squid loop with two Josephson junctions. Having two Josephson junctions in a loop allows you to tune the frequency by tuning the inductance with the help of a magnetic field. So that allows you some tunability of the qubit frequencies if you want. In many architectures, it's only a single junction, in which case the frequency is fixed by design by choosing the size of the Josephson junction and the size of the capacitors. So this is the transmon qubit, and it's been probably one of the last qubits to be invented, but became very popular because of the ease of operation and very robust and reproducible parameters. And many groups use this now. And in order to see that all the quantum properties, you just cannot make the oscillator. The conditions have to be just right. The frequency of these oscillators, which is basically just the LC oscillation frequency, is around 5 gigahertz in the microwave range. And that in temperature units is about 250 millikelvin. And you need to operate at much lower temperatures to ensure that thermal fluctuations do not give excitations in your system. You would ideally like the system to go to the ground state whenever you let it relax. And that requires that you work at low temperatures. These are made out of superconducting materials. So of course you have to go to low temperature for that, but this is aluminum with a TC of about 1 Kelvin, but you need to operate much, much lower in temperature. And that also ensures that the dissipation present in these systems is very low. And that means these oscillators, if they are set into oscillation or put in an excited state, they stay there for a very long time. And that's essentially saying that they have good coherence properties, and that's very important. So by combining all these conditions, you get a very good quantum oscillator, which can be used as a long-lived qubit. Okay. Now, in any processor, a very important requirement is you want to be able to create interactions between these qubits. And this is the only way you can create entangled states of more than one qubit. And since these are electrical oscillators, you can simply just connect them with, say, a capacitor. And this then behaves like a coupled oscillator system. And I'm sure many of you have seen experiments or done experiments of two pendulums hanging from a common thread where they can exchange energy on resonance. And it's basically physics like this and variations of that which allow you to create interaction between these two qubits with the help of a coupling element, which could just be a simple capacitor, but it could also be more complicated structure. Anything which allows you to mediate the electrical excitations on one oscillator to another oscillator. And there are many different ways of doing this, and without this interaction, you cannot create these non-trivial multi-qubit states. So they are an essential feature for building any quantum processor. And you could do it with a capacitor, which is usually done by bringing the qubits into proximity. And that means that you only have nearest neighbor coupling, in the sense that they're right next to each other. Maybe I should really say proximity coupling and not nearest neighbor. And you could also use microwave resonators, which are extended Fabry-Perot-like structures, with reflecting boundaries, and that just allows you to physically move the qubits away from each other. You don't have to be close to each other. Remember that these chips are millimeters in size, and microwave frequencies also have wavelengths on that kind of size scale. So having them right next to each other versus having them several millimeters apart sort of allows you flexibility in the layout of the chips. So you can use resonators as well, and that's a common technique. And you can use essentially this kind of coupling gives rise to what's called a dipolar coupling. You can sort of think of these as dipoles interacting with each other. And typically you want the coupling to only be turned on when you want to do the 2-qubit operation. Otherwise, you would like them to be independent and not necessarily constantly interacting. So one standard method which is used is when you have a fixed coupler like this. So here, it's a fixed capacitor or a fixed resonator, is to keep the qubit frequencies off resonance. So then, even though they're connected, they don't interact with each other, at least very strongly. And then you can either use a magnetic flux to bring them into resonance, and this is one technique which is called flux tuning. Or you can use microwave tones to sort of create an effective interaction when those microwave tones are present. So it's sort of like creating an interaction in a dressed basis. And these are the two standard strategies which are used for turning the couplings on and off. There are also other more complicated coupling elements. So instead of just a simple capacitor, you can have a more complicated circuit, and you will see some examples later in the talk, where instead of relying on the frequency separation, you can just literally turn this capacitor or this connection on and off. So imagine that you had some variable capacitor here, and if you could turn the capacitance value to some very small value, then the coupling will be small. If it is a large value, then the coupling will be stronger. And that's just one example. You could use a network of inductors and various other ways you can do this. So that's another technique, but it requires an additional element and an additional tuning line for that. So people make these choices about how much control lines one needs, but these are sort of standard techniques involved here. So here's an example. Say this is from an old paper from IBM group. You can see there are these two qubits which are shown here as Q1 and Q2, and they are connected with this meandering line, which is a microwave resonator. There are also meandering lines on the other side, but that is actually the resonator which is used for measurement. So here you can see they're spaced far apart, several millimeters, and even though they're spaced far apart, the coupling can be as strong as if they are right next to each other. That's because this bus mediates this coupling. So this is one particular possibility. And here there is a tunable coupler design from the old UCSB group, which is now Google's group, where there are these two qubits, the ones which are shown here in this plus. These are the capacitors of the qubit. And then here in the middle, there is a sort of a complicated circuit where essentially there are inductors and Josephson junctions in loops. And by threading a magnetic flux, you can essentially turn off the interaction between these two sides. So that's the tunable coupler design. And out of the big two companies which are building medium to large scale processors today, these are the two strategies. So IBM typically uses fixed frequency qubits with fixed couplers, and Google uses frequency tunable qubits with tunable couplers, and some combinations of those. Okay. Now, why are these choices important? Okay, and this is because how a qubit or a set of qubits are connected in a network really makes a difference on how a particular algorithm gets translated into a series of hardware operations on the processor itself. So here again, two pictures. It's an old one where it's a linear array of qubits. So this is an example of nearest neighbor coupling with just proximity coupling because of capacitance. But there are 9 of them in a series. And you can imagine that if one had to create an interaction between the first one and the last one, it's really not possible without having to go through all the intermediary ones. Here's a more modern 2D grid design where you have the qubits laid out in a two-dimensional grid and connected. So the red dots are the qubits, and then squiggly lines are the microwave resonators which are creating these couplings. And if one restricts to a very simple design where things are not crossing over each other, this is sort of the best you can do. Maybe you could have had a diagonal connection if you like, but then the other diagonal will not be so straightforward without having some things crossing over, if one wants to, basically assuming that the goal is to increase the connectivity. In contrast, here, trapped ion systems actually have sort of a more natural way of creating interactions between any two qubits in their network, even though, as some of you might know, that typical ion trap is a linear trap and all the ions are actually present in a linear array, but they actually interact with a common vibrational mode. And it's this interaction where each ion is able to interact with the vibrational mode is what is exploited to create what we call all-to-all coupling, which means that you can create an interaction between any two pair of qubits in that network. And there was a paper a while back showing this for 11 qubits. Now this has been enhanced to much larger numbers as well. And the general thing we have been trying to do is that how to do this in an easy way in superconducting qubits to create these interactions without making a very complicated structure, because in principle it's an electrical circuit. I mean, you can imagine connecting each dot to as many dots as possible, but it'll look like a mess. But and the underlying motivation for doing this is really that even for now, where these processors tend to make a lot of errors, which means their coherence times are finite and you only have a very small time to execute your instructions. So you want to be as efficient as possible in terms of the number of steps it takes. So if you have more connectivity, you will translate an algorithm more efficiently. Of course, this is not true for every algorithm. If the algorithm naturally only requires nearest neighbor interaction, it would not make a difference. But in general, this is true. And even though for universal quantum computing, one only needs native two-dimensional gates, native gates which are 2-qubit gates at a time, it sort of tells you that you can construct any arbitrary unitary using that basic requirement is present. It again gives rise to an efficiency question that if you had the ability to make many qubits interact together so that you can do a multi-qubit interaction or evolution in a single step rather than breaking it up into many different steps, this would become translate into a more efficient operation. But this is not so easy just from the point of view of just laying out the qubit, as is sort of evident from this 2D planar layout here. But there are other subtle difficulties as well, and I will come to that later. So before I move on to our idea, I just wanted to say a little bit about some of our earlier work where we had tackled this last point about these native higher dimensional gates. And this was again basically rethinking what a qubit is like. And instead of building a circuit which was a single oscillator, we built a slightly more complicated circuit, with 4 Josephson junctions and this sort of capacitance network, which is just realized in a very simple extension of the original design. So instead of just 2 pads, you now have 4 pads and 4 junctions in this sort of square layout. And this, if you just look at the circuit and say, hey, this is just a bunch of inductors and capacitors, you can think of this in terms of the normal modes of this circuit. It gives rise to 3 high frequency normal modes. And because they are all interacting together because of this Josephson junctions, there's a nonlinear interaction. It really behaves like a coupled 3-qubit system. Or equivalently, if you just look at the 2 lowest levels of each of the qubit, it's an 8-level Hilbert space with appropriate matrix elements between the different levels that you can excite various transitions and really manipulate this 8-level Hilbert space in a much simpler fashion than what you would be able to do with 3 standard qubits interacting using the standard techniques I was mentioning in my previous slide. And in particular, it allows us to do native 3-qubit gates. In fact, the simplest gate in this architecture is a 3-qubit gate. of the Toffoli class. So it's a controlled NOT kind of operation. And also there are these sort of what we call free or error-free C-phase gates in software, which is basically just bookkeeping. And that allows you to implement certain gates, which would be very complicated to do in a conventional architecture. And using this, we were able to run some algorithms and show that actually you can do a much more efficient job of executing those instructions. But it's again not a general solution, so it works well in some cases and doesn't work so well in other cases. And we are now thinking about how to take these multi-qubit blocks and create larger networks. And in fact, so I mentioned that this work was done by Sumeru Hazra, the ring. So these were actually the two topics of his thesis, where one topic is the one I'm going to talk about next. The other topic is where he looks at ways of taking these what we call as multimodal qubits and to connect them together with other qubits to create a larger network. So he did some early experiments on that effort. So now let me move on to the new idea, which we have been working on for the past few years and recently completed. Okay, sort of a repetition of what I said earlier, but maybe in a little bit more detail, and also to point out certain things which have happened in the quantum processor community as well. Showing again two standard layouts, one from IBM's more recent processor design. So here again, each circle is a qubit, and the solid lines here are sort of the connections. And you can see that this is not a simple 2D grid or an extension of the 2D grid as I had shown in the previous slides here, like this one. It's not actually connected as densely as you would have expected for a simple extension. You can see many connections are actually missing. And there is a reason for that, and I'll say that in a second. And here is a more conventional 2D grid, but now these crosses are your qubits, and these blue things are your tunable couplers, and you can see that they're sort of connected in this simple standard two-dimensional grid form, and they can be turned out. But it still means that you cannot create interactions between qubits which are far off in this two-dimensional grid. So if you wanted to create interactions between two qubits which are further away, you have to go through several qubits, which means essentially more operations, right? And that is sort of what we are trying to do. We want to retain the simplicity of the planar structure in terms of fabrication and other logistical difficulties in laying out these qubits, but yet be able to talk to qubits which are further away, in physical distance, or in some other metric of distance in a network. And the reason IBM has actually started moving to more sparse connections, this sort of seems to be completely opposite to the idea I was trying to motivate. And there's a reason for that, and I will mention this towards the end as well. And it's this problem that in the IBM design, the qubits are fixed frequency and the couplers are also fixed. So you can't turn the couplers on and off. They rely on the qubits being off resonance to be sort of in the off state. Now, unfortunately, they're never completely off. And this remnant background interaction between qubits, which gets more and more complicated as you connect many different qubits. So imagine a single qubit which is connected to many qubits. That balance leftover interaction actually plays a role in upsetting the whole balance of the processor. It introduces various kinds of errors. And what IBM seems to have found for their design and processor is that the price they pay by reducing the connectivity, so having more connections, is actually less than the improvement in the errors they get by reducing the problem of these too many leftover interactions. So overall, they actually see an improvement using this metric they invented called the quantum volume, which is sort of a measure of how good your processor is running a circuit of a certain size. So, they have sort of tried to find an optimal balance given the constraints of today's designs. And whereas we are trying to pick one generic idea that higher connectivity in general is better, provided you, of course, you have to solve these problems. And for example, if you had tunable couplers, then this would not be such a big issue because you could in principle turn the interaction off. And I will come to these points in the end. So how does one do this, right? Yeah,
Vijay,
is that a question?
Yeah, Vibhor has a question. Vibhor, please go ahead.
Hey Vijay, Just one clarification about the statement you made about IBM design.
Yeah.
So you said about the remnant coupling that will happen if the grid is too dense. So are you trying to say it's basically the higher levels which are talking to each other? Or if you imagine like, each node having a pure two-level system, which of course does not exist, but you can still have a, coupling. So what is your statement here?
Yeah, so I'm specifically talking about what is called the ZZ error, which in a transmon qubit network is actually due to the presence of the higher levels.
Yeah, go ahead.
And maybe just to elaborate on that, essentially what happens is that the effective two-level spacing of a particular qubit becomes dependent on the state of all the other qubits which is connected to it. So that you can imagine is sort of a terrible situation, because you don't want the property of your qubit to be dependent on the state of the other qubit, which you can never predict, in a general scenario, because the algorithm could be putting them in any states. So it becomes very difficult to fine tune the gate. You might be able to do it for one configuration, but in general, it will become worse as you have more and more connections. And it's this thing, but there have actually been many experiments in the recent past, in the last couple of years, where they have figured out tricks to suppress this. And as Vibhor was alluding to this point, that if you had really true two-level systems, this problem actually doesn't exist, and it would have been less of an issue to worry about. But still, you could have some other kinds of interactions which are present, but presently the main issue is it's not that higher levels are directly interacting, but the physics of a multi-level system connected to each other gives rise to this what is called the ZZ error in technical language.
So what I was trying to get to, like if you have qubits which have much larger enharmonicity, for example, so absolutely, you can pack them more densely.
Yes, absolutely. So that is true. So and some of the new qubit designs like the Fluxonium which are really coming up strongly, have very high enharmonicity. But it's again unclear to me whether the details have been worked out. The Fluxonium doesn't have, it's not like the third level is not present, it's just far away. And in fact, the third level sort of behaves like a transmon. So it's unclear to me how that interaction could potentially affect. It might still have some effect. But yes, if you had an ideal two-level system, this would not be an issue. But we don't have that. So, but yeah. So that would be great. So, but the idea we are working towards will only benefit from better qubit designs, which come up in the future, and hopefully I'll be able to also show you that it's the idea is very sort of independent of the type of qubits to a large extent, and it can be really extended to this. Okay, now of course people have tried to do this kind of things in the past in terms of increasing the connectivity, though it's not been a very favorite topic for many people. And one very sort of obvious thing to do is that, hey, let's just put all the qubits close to each other, right? And instead of there is some room, can't extend, it's not very scalable in the sense of what I've shown here. Maybe 5 qubits crowding around a point is okay. And in here, in this case, they have put sort of this is sort of a cartoon design of an experiment. We'll just see done by a group in China. They put 5 qubits on one end of a resonator and another 5 on the other end. And because these are close to each other, they actually talk to each other. So these qubits are all-to-all coupled. And also because they are coupling to the other side of the resonator, you effectively get all-to-all coupling. And here's the image from this paper. They did a very nice experiment here by creating 10 qubits which are connected to each other, or maybe it's 20 qubits, I'm not remembering. There were several papers actually. And by very careful fabrication and tuning, they were able to make all the couplings almost identical. And then there's a simplification which happens where they can create some highly entangled 10 qubit, 20 qubit states, and they were able to do that and characterize that. The challenge here is that it becomes very, very sensitive to how you place these qubits at a particular location. You have to really fine tune the parameters in design. And the other problem is that because they are very close to each other, there is also crosstalk, because remember that each qubit also has its own control line. So you might be trying to excite this particular qubit here, but that microwave signal could just leak to the qubits nearby. And this generally happens in all 2D sort of designs if you're too close to each other. And this crosstalk can give rise to unwanted errors, and that again is a problem. So while this experiment would work for a relatively small number of qubits, maybe 10, 20, one could push it, but it's not generally going to go beyond that because of these kind of problems. And this is sort of a very simple idea of just crowding the qubits together. There was a very beautiful experiment they did, and the general result is that there's crosstalk, and also the coupling between the different connections or different pairs might not be very uniform in general, and that's going to be a problem. So these different colored line connections are essentially highlighting that these couplings are in general not going to be very uniform. And that can have implications, small variations, it's okay, but then that means you have to tune up everything just right for it to work. But this, is still a common problem to any chip which is designed. Depends on the accuracy of your fabrication, where everything comes out exactly the same. So that problem can happen in other ways as well. Okay, so how do you do this where you can still have qubits talking to each other? Not necessarily right next to each other, but at the same time they're spatially spaced apart so that this crosstalk can be limited. And this is the idea we came up with, where the qubits are connected to a circular microwave resonator. So I've sort of used an extension of this kind of a picture where what we are showing is that there is one resonator or a section of a transmission line between each qubit, but it's then continuous. So it sort of keeps going around and then wraps around itself. So you could really imagine this whole thing as one long transmission line with periodic boundary conditions. So that's also creates a microwave resonator. And really, it actually doesn't help to think about this as a resonator as opposed to just a length of transmission line. And you will see why that is the case in just a bit, right? And this is the idea that a circuit like this actually behaves like a multi-path coupling element. What do I mean by that? If I pick any two qubits, so these blue circles here, there are two paths which connect it, one going clockwise and another going clockwise. And that actually is the key to understanding the simple physics or microwave engineering of this circuit and how to compute the response of such a circuit. There is quasi all-to-all coupling. This particular circuit I have shown here doesn't create a connection between every qubit to every other qubit, but it does it to most qubits. And the qubits are spaced far apart. This section, the squiggly line here is a section of a transmission line, so they are not physically crowded next to each other. So just like the standard two-dimensional layout, they're further away, so the crosstalk can be small, right? And what we see is that you have much more uniform coupling, where you don't have to individually fine-tune the coupling of this qubit to this ring network itself. As long as each qubit is coupled uniformly with the same coupling to the ring resonator, they will have uniform coupling. And this was sort of the surprise for us when we did the calculation and saw that it works out, provided you choose the size of the ring and the placement of the qubits in the right way. And what we get is a connectivity like this, where each qubit is connected to 9 other qubits. So this here is a ring with 12 qubits, so spaced 30 degrees apart. And each of them is connected to 9 other qubits and not connected at all to 2 qubits. So 9 qubits are connected and 2 qubits are not connected. And out of those 9, the coupling strengths have only 2 different values in the most ideal case. So this is actually by design. It's not because of some variation in your fabrication or anything like this. And that's sort of shown by the dark blue and the light blue colors. Qubits which are 120 degrees apart are the ones which are not connected. And that basically can be very simply understood by the fact that in that configuration, the 2 paths are exactly 180 degree in phase difference different. So the coupling essentially cancels out. You get sort of positive coupling from one side and negative coupling from the other side, and they cancel. There's interference between that. So that's easy to understand why that would happen. So it happens for 0 and then 120 and then 240 degrees, if you want to think about like, but it's the same for, it's relative, right? So for each qubit will have one at 120 and 240 with respect to which. So those are not connected. Then at 60 and 180 degrees, the connection is the strongest. So it's kind of strange that this qubit is connected strongest to the qubit diametrically opposite, but somewhat more weakly coupled to the one right next to it. And that's the second coupling, which is slightly weaker. That's the 30, 90, 150, and the other numbers which are possible. So we get two finite values of coupling which are strong, and then there are two positions where there is no coupling at all. And that's actually for this particular choice, as you'll see that there are other choices which are. And the coupling here, again, I want to emphasize, is actually through virtual transitions. What do I mean by that is that the qubits are not resonant with the ring resonator itself. Just like in the general case, where the qubits which are coupled via a section of a transmission line or a half-wave resonator, you're never in resonance with the resonator. The qubits are in resonance or close to resonance, and the resonator is actually detuned. And this basically means that there is never any real excitation of the resonator or the coupling system. So that way, losses and all in the coupling medium play a very small role, and the coupling is mediated by virtual transitions or virtual excitations in the coupling medium. That's sort of a standard technique. The same thing applies here. The ring resonator has a series of resonant frequencies, starting from the fundamental and the first harmonic, but the qubits are way off resonant from that. And it's in this domain, this multi-path picture really works very well. And that's sort of important to keep in mind. So here you've seen this picture before. You're seeing now here, there's a ring in the middle. This is the continuous transmission line. This is sort of a 3D version of what's called a coplanar waveguide transmission line, where you have a central conductor and then ground planes on either side. So we also call them rectangular coax cavities or 3D CPW, and that's the ring in the middle. And then you have these things sticking out. These are also resonators, but they are the readout resonators, just like you saw in the 2D chip design. So it's a very simple layout. It's easily machined in a shop. I keep forgetting to put scale bars, but basically this square is a couple of inches in size. So you can sort of get a sense for it. So it's about that big, the overall structure. And then you can just place these qubits at these prescribed locations where they bridge the gap between the ring resonator and also the readout resonator. So that sort of forms the natural location. And these big pads, I guess I forgot to mention this, apart from providing the capacitance, they also provide the mechanism of interacting with the electromagnetic field which are present in these resonators, and that's how the coupling is mediated. So by carefully positioning these qubits inside a microscope, under a microscope, you can sort of keep this, assemble this system. Okay, so what's the basic physics here? As I said, you have to think of this as two paths here from this end to this end. So the total circumference of this ring is L, capital L, then this is small l, then this is L minus L. And then you can write down the scattering matrix, which is basically defines the microwave properties of this system, and go ahead and compute sort of the coupled modes of these two oscillators, because if they're on resonance, the coupling mediated by them will actually allow them to split into normal modes. And by calculating the amount of splitting, you can measure, basically extract the coupling you will get. So this is a linearized model, of course, but that gives you a very accurate answer for the coupling strength, even if the real system has nonlinear junctions as well. Then you can do this as a function of frequencies, and that's as a function of the locations of the qubits along this ring, which is basically the angular separation. And as I said, we had chosen this particular design with 30-degree spacings, but here's a graph of the continuous plot of coupling strength versus frequency and the relative angle in degrees. And you see these black regions here, which are regions of the zero coupling. This is basically the places where you have destructive interference between the two paths, and they happen at 120 degrees but only at exactly the special frequency which is in the middle of the fundamental and the first harmonic. So in this case, the calculation was done for a 3.5 gigahertz ring. So one full lambda corresponding to 3.1 gigahertz is what fits in this full circle. And the next one is at twice the frequency. So right in the middle, around 4.7 gigahertz or so, is sort of the special operating point. And then you can see that the coupling varies. If you go close to the two resonances, the coupling increases a lot, but then there is no special sort of properties of how the coupling varies. And then if you choose this special frequency in the middle and you choose these 30-degree angles, then you can plot line cuts sort of shown here. So now you have the coupling as a function of frequency for those special angles, 30, 60, 90, 120, 150, 180, and of course you can repeat it back to 360. And then if you focus in the middle, then you see what I had sort of mentioned in the previous slide. There are these two on couplings for 60 and 180 being the strongest, a slightly lower value of coupling for 30, 90, and 150, and then zero coupling for the 120-degree points. But this happens only at a special frequency because this interference is perfect only at that frequency. But over a small range sort of shown here by this yellow region, the coupling doesn't vary that significantly. So you can use, so this allows you some freedom to choose the qubit frequencies in that particular range of frequencies. So you can get 50 to 100 megahertz band in this middle if you really care about keeping the couplings very uniform, or otherwise you can actually expand a little bit more. And the off coupling also sort of rises somewhat slowly here. And there are also other points where coupling can go to zero for different angles, and we're actually working on some ideas using that as well. So that is essentially the idea. It's very simple. It can be computed using simple microwave properties of the circuit. And here is sort of a blow up of how the structure looks like. It's machined in 3 different parts for the main one, and the ring is separate, and then all of this is assembled and bolted down together. And you've seen the picture here, and this is how it looks like. Now there's a top lid, and then after the qubits are placed, this lid is closed upon itself, and you can see small holes in these top lids here. This is where the microwave excitation comes in, where you put your coaxial connector, and that way every qubit has its own control line as well. So it also provides nice 3D integration where the signals are all coming from the top, which are basically connectors which are present on the other side of this top plate. And maybe some of you can notice there are these grooves here in which we have packed indium. This is basically just a soft metal to give you nice RF tight pockets inside this. Otherwise, when you have an extended structure like this, you can create unwanted resonance if things are not really isolated. So we had some trouble with this in our first design, but then it got better and we were able to get very clean resonances for all the different modes here. Right. And the experiment we did, we actually just used 4 qubits placed at these special positions, 1, 3, 9, and 10. And the reason this was, we wanted to keep the experiment simple, because remember that if you put many qubits, lots of interaction is going to happen, and recovering the information from that can be quite challenging. But the choice of these 4 positions actually gives you all the possible relative angles. So you have 30, 60, 90, 150, 120, and 180. So with 4 qubits, we're able to basically verify the idea which we calculated and I showed you in the previous slides. So this was the experiment we did. The experiments themselves are fairly straightforward. Because these were fixed frequency qubits, which means I couldn't apply a magnetic flux inside them to tune them into in and out of resonance. We actually used the microwave power to do that by using the AC Stark shift effect. So we had chosen the qubit parameters in such a way that they were close to each other in frequency, but not exactly on resonance. Anyway, the fabrication variability gives you that, but we picked 4 qubit frequencies carefully and cooled them down. And then by applying a power, we could make 1 qubit cross the frequency of the other. So that's what you're seeing here. And because of the coupling, so on either side, you see 2 spectroscopy lines. If you take a vertical line cut, the blue sort of represents the qubit frequencies. There are 2 qubits, but then when they go through each other, they show this avoided crossing, which is a characteristic signature of a coupling between 2 modes. And then by measuring the splitting, the maximum separation here, that gives you 2 times the coupling strength, or 2G, for that particular pair of qubits. And we repeat this experiment for all the different pairs. We also did another experiment, which is basically how the ZZ error is measured, which I had mentioned earlier. Essentially, what you look at is how much does the frequency of one qubit change when you flip the state of the other qubit which you're interested in. So when all these experiments are being done, we keep the unwanted qubits, like the other two qubits, far away as possible in frequency space. And then we do the experiments for the particular pair. And these frequency measurements are done by using what's called the Ramsey experiment, which basically measures the free precession frequency in a detuned frame. And this one here is done with qubit 3 in ground state and qubit 3 in the excited state. And then by looking at the shift in this oscillation frequency, we can get what the ZZ error, and that ZZ error is directly related to the coupling strength between those two qubits. So by measuring this for all the pairs and then sort of solving a 4-qubit Hamiltonian numerically and inverting it, you can extract the couplings from that. And this is basically the result. The experiments from the anti-crossing and the experiments from this cross-Kerr or the ZZ experiment are shown here in blue and red. And the one we extracted from the microwave simulation using the finite element analysis of the full microwave structure are shown in black. So you can see that they all sort of agree to each other reasonably well. You have the main feature that at 120 degrees, there is very little coupling. At 60 and 180, the coupling is maximum. And in fact, you see here, we have been careful about the sign of the coupling, which I didn't mention earlier. But as you go from 60 to 180, there is a phase inversion which happens because of the additional path length you have. So after 120, the sign flips. And then, of course, if you go again to 240, the sign will flip again. And the 30, 90, and 150 are also sort of slightly smaller and similar to each other. You see some variations from the predictions and the data. And that is because, the model what we design and what we make are slightly different. There are also some subtleties involving how the ring is held in place. We have tried our best to actually not to break the symmetry of the ring. So even though I mentioned that there were only 4 qubits, we had actually put dummy chips in all the other 8 slots to keep the distribution of the silicon chips uniform. And that's because, the dielectric of the silicon actually affects the mode in the resonator. So we try to do that, but it's very difficult to keep that perfect in an experiment. And that's one of the sources of the error here. Let me just take a look. So Bala, I have take maybe 8 to 10 more minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah.
So so basically this sort of shows that the basic idea is solid and it works. We can show it for all the different angles for this particular choice of 30-degree spacing. And as I mentioned, the variation is due to the asymmetry and some chip placement errors as well. So remember, this is done manually. But of course, we had looked at this before because we are going to place the chip manually. The exact location will affect. And this is one of sort of the, in some sense, the difficulties of working in a 3D architecture, even though it's modular and has lots of advantages. So we did study, how tolerant it is to the placement of the chip using finite element simulations. So I'm not going to go into the detail here, but we were able to look at this and saw that, okay, there's sort of a patch here where the coupling doesn't change that strongly, but you still have to be careful about placing it within maybe 100 microns or so. And that's possible to do under a microscope. And our extraction and measurement of even the coupling of the qubit to the readout cavity, which is the other resonator, was reasonably uniform. And in one case, we measured a lower value. And later on, when we opened up the device, we did see that the chip was sort of a little too much shifted towards one side. So sort of have a handle on this as well. And then the placement of the qubit in the other direction also affects the interqubit coupling to some extent. But again, there's sort of a fairly sort of slow moving area in the middle. So we had already checked that this is not going to be completely impractical to actually measure. And what we had extracted from the finite element simulations and we measured in the experiment was, in reasonable agreement for what is expected for these kind of experiments. You can never have it exactly, but it doesn't matter. You're going to measure all these parameters when you measure the device anyway. So you can only fine tune them to maybe a few % at the best. So people have been trying to improve this. We also looked at then the crosstalk experiments because we wanted to show that this architecture really minimizes crosstalk, and we essentially checked that if one is driving qubit 10, how does it affect the qubits which are further away. So in this case, for example, something which is that far away, and we used this cross resonance protocol, which is basically a 2-qubit entanglement gates. I will not go into the detail, but from that you can extract the effective leakage which is happening, and we got these numbers in this bottom row here for the different pairs, and the one which was bad was slightly bad was the one which had that placement problem. But these numbers are about an order of magnitude smaller than what one typically sees in 2-dimensional chip designs as well. So part of the reason here is the 3D architecture, which provides good isolation of the different parts of the circuit, and the other part is the design itself, that the qubits are not all packed close to each other. And we check the same thing for measurement crosstalk as well, because again, you don't want to be measuring qubit 10 but accidentally dephase or collapse the qubit which is not being measured. So we again ensured that this additional dephasing was at least several magnitudes of orders of magnitude lower than the one which is intended. So here the tallest lines are the one which are measuring the effect on the qubit that is being measured, and the other bars are, and please note it's a log axis. So this was again a very good sign that crosstalk is low at both these frequencies, the qubit frequency and the measurement frequency, which are usually a couple of gigahertz away from each other. Okay, so to sort of finish up, we wanted to see how to even take this forward. So the experiments for this part are not done yet, but we did some simple calculations that, okay, how do you make a larger qubit system? Does it work for more number of qubits? The simplest idea is to just make a larger ring. So instead of a ring which is 3 gigahertz, 1 lambda at 3 gigahertz, you can go say 3 times lower. It's a much longer ring now, 3 times longer, and you can now place the qubits at the same physical distance, but now the angular separation is 10 degrees, and this extends trivially like what the previous design was. But now we also realize that this is of course not experimentally demonstrated, but we realize that this qubits here should really have some kind of a tunable coupler between them and the ring, and I will show you something at the end, because otherwise there'll be too much connectivity and interaction without any control. But barring that detail, what you get here is now instead of 1 qubit being connected to 9 other qubits, you have now 1 qubit connected to 27 other qubits, again with a strong value of coupling and then a slightly lower value of coupling, and now several more are at the zero coupling level, right? So that's natural to extend. Now you have many more combinations where you will have destructive interferences. So then you have a much larger connected network, and please note that the complexity in some sense has not really increased. It's just a larger ring, just have to make it larger, place more qubits around, everything remains exactly the same. And this gives you one way of doing it. Of course, the price one pays is that the range of frequency in that special band, and now it's not between the first and the second harmonic or the fundamental and the first harmonic, but it's sort of at the third and the fourth. So the frequency variation becomes much stronger, which you can sort of get a sense here somewhat. And that means the range of frequencies over which the coupling will be uniform will be smaller. So that's the price you pay for going to a larger qubits. But if one is working with tunable couplers, then you don't need to have this frequency variation window to be very large. We also looked at how you can connect multiple rings together. So rather than making one larger ring, what if you had 2 rings with qubits on them and then you connect them? So here we looked at this idea and we realized that we need to connect it with a transmission line which has a length of lambda by 2 and a characteristic impedance Z by 2, where Z and lambda are the properties of the first string. And if you do it like this, then you again get a very simple extension of the original idea. So we calculated the properties of a system like this, where there's a central ring with 6 qubits at 60-degree spacing. So this is similar to the first design. And now there are several other 6 more qubits which are now placed in between those connections, which so 060 are the qubits, but the 30-degree point connects to another ring. So it's now again easy to see that for a ring here, the rings which are placed at 120 degrees will have no coupling. So a qubit here will not talk to any qubits in these two rings, but it will talk to every other qubit in all the other rings. So what we found here is that now if you have a qubit in the outer ring, it is again connected to 27 other qubits and not connected to the others. But the qubits in the central ring are actually slightly different than the outside. They are connected to 39 other qubits, and remember there are 6 qubits per ring, and there are 7 rings, so a total of 42 qubits in this design. And again, you have these two different values of coupling, though now this intermediate value of coupling is somewhat smaller. It's about a factor of 2 smaller as opposed to a factor of √2 in the first design. But the rest of the properties remain the same. You again pay the price that the frequency variation would be a lot stronger as you go away from the special point. Okay, and sort of the very long-term idea is that we can put many of these rings together where the qubits have tunable couplers connecting them to the ring only. And remember here that the tunable coupler is really in a local position. It's between the qubit and its nearest connection to that ring. And as opposed to imagining a multi-qubit network where there are couplers running all over the place. So that really sort of tells you that this is actually practical to implement. And if one really wants to have more flexibility, one could even introduce tunable couplers between these rings itself, how the rings are connected. And then, you can really isolate parts of the networks, do quantum operations while the others are kept separate. And you can even parallelize operation by, connecting some qubits and keeping the other couplers off. And that way you can do operations. In a single ring, this parallel operation is kind of tricky. It depends on how you put the frequencies of the qubits together. But the always on coupling can be problematic, as I mentioned earlier, because of this ZZ error. So we have been working, and this is sort of the last couple of slides on this tunable coupler design, sort of borrowing from these inductive loops here. And we actually sort of made a simple microwave model and showed that with some reasonable parameters which are not outside the domain of standard fabrication things, we could essentially replicate a similar behavior. So this is actually a combination of simple microwave simulation using circuits to show that with the tunable inductors you can get the same kind of behavior. So at highest coupling at 60 and 180 degrees, and the slightly lower coupling at the other values, and zero coupling as that. And we have started designing this now in a 2-dimensional design, because these squids and all with flux tuning lines is difficult to make it in a 3D architecture. So here's sort of a first draft of the CAD which the student is working on. And so here in the middle you see this meander drawing is the ring resonator, and then there are these XMON style qubits at 6 locations with these tunable coupler designs present here. It's sort of an adaptation of what's called the GMON design, which I had shown in the previous slide. So we are now doing some calculations and finite dimensional simulations to figure out the exact properties, and we'll probably first start with a simple non-tunable design in 2D, because this would be the first 2D chip of this type we make here. But we recently, while our paper was in review, we found there was another group in China which actually made a 2-qubit version with a ring in 2D and showed that the coupling is independent of the position, but between the qubit and the resonator, but not really between 2 qubits. And then they use a calculation similar to ours to show that why it doesn't work in that case. Basically, they had used a simple model of modeling the ring resonator as just a single resonator and not this multipath interference. So this is what Anirban is working on. So with that, I just want to conclude that we have this really nice new design for a ring resonator, which is very compatible with all the standard ideas in superconducting qubits, yet it allows you new functionality with minimal design changes and complications. We did a demonstration in 3D circuit QED, but it's just our choice. We like working in these 3D machined architectures, easier and more convenient for us. But it's fully compatible doing this in 2D, and we have started work on that as well. The key features are, uniform coupling and low microwave crosstalk, apart from, of course, the strong connectivity. Theoretical calculations show that we can extend this to larger network, and use of tunable coupler will actually increase the practicality of this problem. But coming back to again what Vibhor had mentioned, that if you had a different qubit design, for example, a fluxonium, here it's really plug and play. You remove the transmon qubit and you put a fluxonium qubit, and more or less everything works exactly the same way, barring some other details of how you want to do the gates and things like that. And I think what we are really excited about is now trying to use this. The first experiment was really sort of demonstrating the physics of this ring coupler, where we just shown that there are qubits, they talk to each other in the way we predict them, but we haven't really done any algorithms or any many-body physics, and that's what we are working on right now. And those are the more challenging and more rewarding experiments as well. And we feel that there might be a strong application in quantum error correction, because essentially quantum error correction requires a multi-qubit network which can be manipulated to create these special entangled states and making measurement parity operators, doing this parity measurements on them. And that I feel will very strongly be helped if the connectivity is very strong. So that's one thing we are really focusing on, but we're also talking to other theorists, both in TIFR and outside, to see how we can use this ability now. This is a new functionality in superconducting circuits to do some interesting many-body physics experiments, which might have not been possible before. And if there are people here, and if you have ideas, I would be happy to talk to you about how to use this capability to do interesting many-body physics experiments. So with that, let me thank all my students. This is an old picture. We haven't gotten around taking our pandemic picture yet. But the work is done by all the students and postdocs and scientific staff. So thanks to all of them, and thank you for this invitation and for your attention. I'll take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Vijay. Questions for Vijay, please. And let's applaud Vijay with the virtual applaud button. It was a great talk. So yeah, please raise your hands for questions. Bala, please go ahead with your question.
Vijay, thanks for the very, very nice talk. And I have one question. So did you measure the 2-qubit gate fidelities in this sort of an architecture?
No, we have not done that yet.
Okay.
What we did that in this, as part of this experiment where we measure this crosstalk, that experiment is essentially the 2-qubit cross resonance gate experiments.
Exactly.
But we only used it to do Hamiltonian tomography and extract the coupling, effective coupling, and the leakage, because one of the terms which comes out of the fitting is this what we call the classical crosstalk. But we did not actually implement a full gate and compute the fidelity and things like that, because I mean it was not going to be a surprise for us that is going to be possible, because nothing has changed. The physics is exactly identical to connecting 2 qubits with a resonator. And also in this particular experiments, the coherence of the qubits were not that great. So the 2-qubit gate fidelity would have been poor, but not because of the ring design. So our first experiment restricted ourselves. In fact, this new experiment, which I mentioned from the Chinese group, they actually did a 2-qubit, but I think they did a CZ gate or a C-phase gate. I can't remember now. I should actually add that reference here. Forgot to do that. But it's a paper in Applied Physics Letters, came out a couple of months back, and they did that. But that's basically the next step where we will use this to do 2-qubit gates. But the gate fidelity should have absolutely nothing to do with the choice of the ring. What it will have to do, of course, is what connectivity I choose in that experiment, and then all the ZZ errors and everything will play a role. It does not have anything to do with the ring architecture itself. So we didn't bother with it in the first experiment just yet.
Okay. And so the the coupling rates that you have between qubits range between 2 and 4 megahertz or something, right?
That's right.
So have you, so roughly what durations for the qubit gates do you, and how do they compare with what other people are doing?
So the choice of getting a coupling rate in sort of this 3 to 5 megahertz range was also intentional. This is not a limitation of the architecture at all. So just to show you here, if these pads were chosen to be longer or a different aspect ratio for the resonator, in terms of the impedance and all we had chosen, we could have gotten much stronger coupling rates as well. The reason for this particular choice of coupling rate is that this is the acceptable range for doing cross resonance gates. And that has been sort of our choice for the 2-qubit gate in our group so far. This is the one which is developed by the IBM group, because it's a fixed frequency architecture. So we wanted to use that, and this 3 to 5 megahertz is what works best for the standard cross resonance architecture. Though there have been now new papers where using optimal control techniques and grape techniques, it's possible to go to higher couplings. And essentially what happens is that if you go to higher couplings, there are these unwanted terms in this cross resonance gate and they give rise to more errors. So this is sort of a sweet spot in that. But it turns out that it's not really fundamental. So both with some new results and also our own collaboration with the SAI at IIT Bombay, where they're using optimal control techniques to see how fast this gate went. So now coming to the speed, the typical gates we have done with these kind of coupling rates will have a gate time around 150 to 200 nanoseconds in that kind of range.
Okay. That's quite comparable to the IBM results, I would say.
Absolutely. See, the thing is that number is not based on any particular technical achievement. It's really just comes from the parameters. So this optimal choice of 3 to 5 megahertz is basically taken from their exploration of the physics of cross resonance, and that's where it comes from. So when you limit the cross resonance gate to the standard protocol as opposed to optimal control, where you can basically have some funny looking pulse shape which the algorithm spits out, you have this restriction. If you go to larger couplings, then this both the ZZ error and unwanted excitations of the control qubit can give rise to errors which will reduce your overall fidelity. So we don't anticipate the gates. So when we did the Hamiltonian tomography experiment, we basically effectively this experiment also allows you to extract the gate speed you will anticipate. So somewhere in the 150 to 200 nanoseconds.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Apurva, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. Hi, Vijay. I have a couple of questions about variations on the geometry. Mm-hmm. One is, have you looked at star geometry where the central qubit or whatever resonator you can look at as a dummy system which acts like a center of mass mode and doesn't really get involved in the dynamics, and all the corners of the stars are then connected to each other through the central node, and they will have equal coupling between all the corners. I don't know whether the properties of the transmole qubits and all the frequencies, etc., can be tuned for such a geometry or not, but that is one possible variation. The other variation in geometry is what are called Ramanujan graphs. So these are sparsely connected graphs, but at the same time offer high reachability between long distance nodes. And there is a well-known theory behind it, and it is actually used in construction of internet networks, while keeping efficiency high but the physical connectivity low. So I'm just curious if you have seen this kind of or thought about this kind of geometries also.
Yes, so there are actually several things in your question. I'll actually take the last part first. See, what you are talking about is what is the effective connectivity diagram at the end of whatever we are making, right? Now, this ring architecture basically allows you to get, for example, this kind of connectivity. But this is the maximum possible thing you can do with this. But by choosing the locations of which qubits are placed, you can actually get different connectivity diagrams in the same architecture. And this is something we have been exploring, in fact, for an upcoming experiment where we did not want very high connectivity, but we still wanted to use this architecture. We were actually able to do that by placing the positions of the qubit. And one particular thing which did come out of that is the star architecture with the central qubit and then qubits connected to it on the outside. That is also possible by choosing the careful combination of number of rings and where you position the qubits. Our sort of broad motivation here was really to create a simple two-dimensional layout which allows you beyond nearest neighbor connectivity and dense connectivity. Of course, the exact connectivity is flexible and you can choose it. And you mentioned this point about the Ramanujan graphs, and there's also, I think, a term. In fact, when I was talking about this experiment with some other people, I was also made aware of this idea of what are called small world networks. And there, this point you mentioned that, if you have this kind of distributed network, but the cost you pay is actually creating those connections, there are some efficient solutions to that where you have maybe a cluster, but then maybe one long connection and then another cluster, and that allows you to overall optimize this sort of cost of, if making the connections is expensive, you can actually optimize that. And those kind of networks can also be created. But here, in that sense, there is no price here. Once we have this particular choice, all the connections have the same price in terms of the design. But we are now looking at these different types of connectivity to not from the architecture point of view, but from the kind of physics we can do with those. Because everything, the underlying platform is exactly the same. We just have to decide on how many rings, what connections, and then where we place the qubits. And that's a huge amount of flexibility possible. So we are looking at it from the point of view of doing different types of interesting many body physics experiments or multi-qubit processor experiments using the ring idea. I'm assuming that you did, when you said geometry, you did not mean changing the geometry of the ring from a ring shape to some other shape. We did explore those in the early part, but we found that the ring really is sort of special in that sense. If you keep a central qubit and connect just resonators in all the different directions, it doesn't work as simply as you would think it would, because of, again, all the multiple paths involved. So we found that the ring actually works best in that sense. There might be more solutions if one is talking about different physical geometries of laying out and which might give longer connectivities. But this seems to work quite well for this kind of stuff. Of course, this doesn't give you all-to-all connectivity here. But if you just had maybe 4 qubits, then it's all-to-all connected. But then there are simpler ways of doing that. But you get almost all-to-all with this multiple rings or even single rings. So.
Okay, Yogendra, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vijay, for a very illuminating lecture and for the emphasis that you have given on the hardware and the experimental part of quantum computing, which is very interesting for me to listen to. I just had a question. In the good old days, I'm a mechanical engineer, so I was just wondering whether you could draw any parallels with analog computers that we used to design for solving PDEs and stuff. Mm-hmm. In some way, are you trying to get back to devices like analog computers did in those days, using this hardware, solving the Schrodinger equation, for example? I could not get the picture of what is the final. Where do you finally put this hardware into computing? Maybe I missed out, but I was wondering whether your ring architecture, for example, would give better, decoherence, improve upon decoherence or other things that we commonly read in literature. So I was wondering whether you're going in that direction, or which way are you headed in terms of finally coming up with the computer.
Sure.
Computer.
So yeah. So
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. I mean, I did not give a very broad general introduction to quantum computing in this particular talk. Let me clarify a few things right away. The ring architecture does not give you better coherence, but it also does not give you worse coherence. It is not an attempt to do that at all. Okay. The ring architecture is purely a new design for a coupling element, and how to lay it out, how to lay out qubits in a two-dimensional grid, but yet have the ability to create interactions between qubits which are not right next to each other. So please, so this figure here actually sort of encompasses what we have tried to do and achieved. The physical connection, which is actually this ring, only goes around in a circle like this.
Okay.
The effective connection is what is shown on the right side, right? Even though this qubit is completely diametrically opposite, there is actually a strong interaction between these two qubits. And nothing here is changing the paradigm of how to do quantum computing or anything. This is conventional quantum computing. We have just introduced a new coupler, which will allow you to create multi-qubit networks where interactions between qubits further away from each other is possible, as opposed to what is currently possible in the design. And the reason for that, as I explained in the beginning of the talk, is that if you want to say in this particular picture here, if I wanted to do a 2-qubit gate between Q12 and Q6, and in this geometry, I can do it directly in one step. But if I really had, imagine that this Q12 to Q6 was laid out in a linear fashion with couplings only to nearest neighbor, then in order to create an effective gate between 12 and 6, I would have to go through all the other qubits. That means more steps, that means more time, and essentially means more error, because each step will give you an error because of the various decoherence processes. So it allows you to minimize the number of steps to do a particular unitary. And it's primarily a topological problem of how to lay out these qubits. So by using the physics of a circular coupling bus, we're able to circumvent that physical constraint. So apart from that, there is no other new capability it is introducing, but this is a very powerful capability. We have yet not demonstrated all the possible powerful things yet, but that's coming next, and hopefully other groups will also take this idea and push it to its limits in terms of what kinds of new experiments it will enable.
Thanks again for a very wonderful, engaging talk.
Thank you.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we should wrap up the.
Can I ask a question? One small question, small one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm around. I have no problem staying around, but yes, you should.
No, I do understand this is getting late. But Vijay, I have a very nice question. I have heard this talk, so I don't have any other technical question. But yes, given the fact that certain number of qubits, certain pairs of qubits are not communicating with each other.
Yeah.
If you take a 12-qubit ring,
yes,
what would you effective number of qubits on the processor?
Sorry, I lost you at the critical moment. If you had 12 qubits in a ring, what was the question?
I have 12 qubit system. What is going to be the effective? So if you say I've got a quantum processor, what would be the effective number of qubits on this quantum processor? Because some of the qubits are not communicating with each other, right?
Well, they're not. They're only pairs of qubits which are not. It's a 12-qubit
processor.
It is a 12-qubit processor. The one possible metric to compare it would be the quantum volume of such a processor. But because we have not yet demonstrated the gate fidelities, I cannot compute it for my system. But if one says that all the 2-qubit gates can give me the same kind of fidelity as, say, some standard IBM architecture, then I could calculate that, and that number will be higher than any other design which exists. But this has to be demonstrated, but it will not be, the demonstration might or might not work, will be for other technical reasons, not because of the rings idea itself. So it's still a 12 qubit processor, just like 12 qubits in a linear array is also going to be a 12 qubit processor, or 12 qubits in this kind of some weird square or here is also a 12 qubit processor. So that's why IBM invented this metric, which is volume, metric, the quantum volume, which sort of roughly tells you the size of a quantum circuit you can execute without too much error, in some way. So if all things remaining equal, more connectivity means higher quantum volume. That is sort of well understood. But if higher connectivity leads to higher errors in the 2-qubit gates, then there will be a reduction in quantum volume because of that, because you'll get more errors. So you have to balance it out. And that's what I was saying in the beginning, that IBM for now has realized that they want to reduce the connectivity because the improvement in 2-qubit gate fidelities they get is much higher than the price they pay for reduced connectivity, even in the quantum volume metric. So hopefully in the future, we will be able to show that with the right combination of parameters, we can have more connectivity and also more quantum volume. And that would be the hope. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Vijay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Vijay, for the great, fantastic talk. I definitely learned a lot. Let's applaud Vijay again for the great talk, and
thank you.
Thanks for staying up late with us, and wish everybody a good night and take care.